co-chair of the MFA Designer as Author program and the author of over 100 books. This is one of his lectures in the Paul Rand Lecture Series.
You can't run a regime without great signs and logos. The fasci, the ancient Roman symbol of power, was adopted by Mussolini because it conjured a glorious imperial past while projecting a progressive future. The axe blade, wrapped by rods, symbolized the sharp edge that the fascists wielded against its bourgeois enemies. The term fascio, incidentally, which eventually became the name of Mussolini's anti-democratic, pro-militaristic political movement, was a generic term for any extreme factional political group, regardless of political leaning, and was sometimes used for non-political organizations as well. In his first act of political branding, Mussolini appropriated the term, and since then, fascist has been associated with ultra-right-wing, usually repressive movements, parties, and governments. The Italian version of standardization, known as reform of custom, included changing the Roman calendar so that 1922, when the fascists assumed power, became Anno 1. Other transformative policies included altering the linguistic system so that the formal third-person singular lei was officially abolished, replaced by the informal second-person singular tu, or plural voi. All dialects were outlawed as remnants of former inglorious occupations. And the effeminate handshake, they called it effeminate, was eliminated in favor of the masculine, straight-armed Roman salute. The Passo Romano, the Roman goose-step march, demanded that the new fascist man be strong and slim and have good thighs. The flaw in Mussolini's branding strategy was that despite all the bombastic rhetoric and military pageantry, Mussolini's mythology represented the appearance, not the substance, of fascism. The image-savvy Mussolini devoted more time to publicity than to policy, to the extent that publicity actually became policy. He believed that form and substance was the same thing. Pastiche was originality. Grandiosity was its own reward, for the veneer gave the illusion of authority. He confused pomp for power. Mussolini so efficiently branded fascism through symbolic and concrete manifestations, from uniforms to buildings, from the Roman salute to the Passo Romano high kick marching step, that he himself was infatuated by the fascist myth. Mussolini paid homage to the grandeur that was imperial Rome, yet made pastiche and kitsch out of it. Still, he insisted that references to Rome were not simply nostalgic contemplation of the past, but hard preparation for the future. Fascist style evolved through various iterations and also famously embraced aspects of radical futurism's art and poetry, as well as the imperial Roman conceit. Through these ideas, Duce gave the Italians a flattering image of their country as powerful and modern, free from oppression, poverty, and crime. So committed was Mussolini to managing the trappings of power, he insisted on enforcing the most petty rules to maintain the style as he conceived it. His son-in-law, Count Ciano, who briefly served as the fascist minister of press and propaganda, complained that Duce, quote, takes care in person of the minutest details. In this specific case, he meant the militia's parades. Let's move on to the swastika. It was an ancient symbol of good fortune with occult implications. Although it had been used by nationalist and occult groups in Germany before the Nazis adopted it, Hitler realized its visual and symbolic power as beneficial to his movement and competitive with the communist mark. The swastika was an X with the literal and figurative hooks, which as a mnemonic increased its visual strength. With Germany's defeat in 1918, numerous veterans, some members of secret orders and lodges, believing that Jews, communists, and Republicans betrayed them and profited off defeat, banded together into paramilitary organizations known as the Freikorps or Free Corps, or Stahlhelm, the steel helmet, dedicated to fight a civil war for the fatherland against traitors. I always wanted to find the branding manual for the Nazi Party. The Reich Deutsche Arbeitsfront, or DAP, which oversaw the enticingly titled Strength Through Joy and Beauty of Work divisions under the watchful eyes of leader Dr. Robert Ley, maintained the overall visual look and style and makeup of the party and the publication of its handbook, the Organizational Book of the NSDAP. Published in 1936, over a decade after the original ABCs of National Socialism, which laid down the basic Nazi Party structures, the third and last edition was the most inclusive handbook, perhaps the most important branding document, and as close to resembling a corporate standards manual as the party came to codifying the Nazi Party directives and organizational regulations. There are guidelines for the party officials through state culture chambers, as well as the Labor Front and other subsidiary groups. There are 3 chapters devoted to laws that protected the Reich, the party, German blood and honor, the flag, and various signs and symbols. The Nazis pursued a design policy that wed modernism and archaicism, shifting from modernity to tradition as suited the needs of the policy or strategy. Assumptions were made as to Hitler's particular tastes, and his minions second-guessed his wishes. Surprisingly, especially given the thoroughness of the organizational handbook, in the end, many different governmental bureaus, agencies, and subdivisions independently administered to aspects of the Nazi brand, from posters to typography. Propagating the rightness of commonplace letter forms became part of the NSDAP's mission. To officially practice graphic design and typography, designers were compelled to join a culture chamber that represented every art and design discipline. These replaced the outlawed independent trade and craft unions and adhered to their regulations. Formulated somewhere in the bowels of these chambers, the aesthetic guidelines dictated not only how Nazi and government documents should look, but even how lettering for unofficial use must conform to the accepted system. Control was exercised beyond those men and women working directly in the German Propaganda Atelier, or DPA, the official graphic design division of the Reich's Ministry for Enlightenment and Propaganda. There was no central office of type doctrine, so ministries established their own styles within basic prescriptions, though one in particular, the DAF, directed by Robert Ley, was responsible for developing graphic and teaching materials like the book seen here. Type was deemed a critical art form, scrutinized as much for its functional traits as for its German origins. But ultimately, minor bureaucrats determined what was sanctioned or not. Verboten, for example, were typefaces designed by Jews and other cultural Bolsheviks. Lucien Bernhard's typefaces, for example, were denigrated because he was thought to be a Jew. He was not. Rejection of non-German Roman alphabets from commercial and government printing was a recurring theme in Nazi cultural propaganda. A campaign to stamp out non-German lettering was promoted through stickers and slogans admonishing citizens to use Gothic letters or Deutsche Schrift, the indisputable type for the German nation. It was also referred to as Die schöne Deutsche Schrift, beautiful German script. Let's move to the Communist Chinese. The communist stars both symbolized the people of the new China, and they further implied a heavenly utopian mission. This was one of the Red Guard armbands paying homage to Mao. And these were the little red books, Bibles of Maoism. When the Bolsheviks seized power in Russia, they rejected the symbolic trappings of this aristocratic folly and all its superstitious authoritarianism. Early Marxists held a puritanical view of symbolism, even avoiding new symbols used by their communist antecedents, like the mid-19th century Parisian League of Outlaws and the League of the Just, and their employ of Masonic-like initiation rituals, salutes, and iconography designed to unify their members. In 1917, the Soviet leaders assumed there would be no reason to adapt any state symbols. The revival of traditional Russian forms, called embourgeoisement, injected images of Soviet power into the visual lexicon, however. The red star, whose 5 points representing the unity of peoples on the 5 continents, replaced the Romanov eagles on the tops of buildings The hammer and sickle, originally designed as a hammer and plow and conceived in 1918 to represent the unity of the proletariat and the peasantry, was decreed for adoption by all Soviet republics. The efficient running of state, even that appeared to reject convention, demanded a reinstatement of certain traditions, including the reinstitution of pictorial symbols, like a flag and a coat of arms. In 1922, the treaty concerning the formation of the Soviet Union Socialist Republics, Article 22, noted the USSR shall have its own flag, arms, and state seal. Although the Bolsheviks denounced the imperial coat of arms as being representative of the predatory policies of the czars and emperors, the basic Soviet state seal format remained consistent with the old order. Laws were passed so that these seals became inviolate. Let's move now to the cult of uniformity. And what this means is fealty through consistent branding traits. Mussolini restructured the Milan Fascio into the Fasci Italiani di Combattimento, or the Italian Fighting League. Its members, known as fascisti, were formed into armed squadristi, paramilitary squads who were identifiable by a single consistent piece of apparel, the black shirt, as other coordinated uniform accoutrements were too expensive at that time. But Mussolini was not the innovator here. The colored shirt was introduced in Italy during the 1848 Risorgimento, or unification, when Giuseppe Garibaldi's Camicia Rossa, or red shirts, battled to end foreign occupations and unify the nation. After World War I, color-coded shirts distinguished various international fascist and nationalist movements in Austria, France, Ireland, Eastern Europe, and even the United States with the gold shirts. These particular uniforms were designed by the famous Italian poster artist Paolo Goretto, who briefly served in Mussolini's bodyguard. Symbolic gestures often reinforce the brands. For instance, Hitler borrowed the Roman salute from Mussolini, who instituted it shortly after assuming power as an ideological alternative to the bourgeois handshake. Hitler insisted, however, it derived not from Rome, but from a medieval German practice, but its real derivation was clear. In Germany, the raised outstretched arm was called the German salute, and along with the greeting Heil Hitler, which substituted for the conventional Guten Tag, it symbolized fealty to the Führer. Used by all party members prior to 1933, after the takeover of power, it was ordered that civil servants use it as the official greeting. Gestures of power were also celebrated in graphic art. Power on the military and industrial fronts were always apparent. But graphics were not the only branding tools. The Nazis were propagated through pageantry, spectacle, and song. The stage-managed marches of upwards of 30,000 SA could surge for as long as 5 hours, giving the impression of a gigantic graphic movement. Nazi organizers, it seems, preferred nocturnal events because the mass was more likely to be influenced at night. What's more, they were more dramatic than daytime observances. The technical mastery of the play of light and darkness set a Wagner-esque stage on which Nazi power could be zealously expressed. Uniforms were symbols of status in the Reich. In the USSR, however, the marriage of industry and agriculture was heroicized, as was the glory of the military as seen in this religious-like image. Note the halo above the saintly soldier. This is not unique to the Nazis, but it was part of their overall official branding strategy. Without a rather steady diet of rabid anti-Semitic words and pictures, posters, pamphlets, newspapers, like Der Stürmer, there could be no Holocaust. Graphics were key in depicting the rapacious Jew and the subhuman enemy. This is a poster for the Eternal Jew. The campaign to discredit Jews had to be steady, forethought, and memorable, and much of it came directly from the Promi. The Stürmer published children's books, most infamously The Poison Mushroom, a repulsive depiction of the Jew designed as much for adults as children, laying out the preposterous lies used to justify anti-Semitic policy. Official sanction was required so as to lull the population into tacit acquiescence. Never once was Hitler's name or image tarnished by association with the anti-Jewish policies, but the implication was clear. He said it enough times. Another of de Sturmer's books for children compare the Jew with the sly fox and contrast the innocent Aryan Fräulein with the evil Jewish seducer. The DAF published charts delineating who was full, half, and quarter Jew. Using agricultural imagery, this cautions against interbreeding of the races. Prior to instituting the final solution, even Auschwitz produced currency or Lagergeld and stationery for prisoners to use. The former were usually small rectangular notes with a dubiously ironic text like "work makes you free," and a colored triangle to indicate from which barrack or work battalion the user was from. The latter was a self-contained mailer with a long list of restrictions from the commandant set perfectly in black letter. The identification system implemented throughout the concentration camp network was based on an inverted triangle known as the Winkel, made of variously colored fabrics to distinguish homosexuals from habitual criminals, from political enemies, from Jehovah's Witnesses, from gypsies, from, of course, Jews. This color code and symbol code, concentric circles, for example, distinguished failed escapees and were worn on the prisoners' sleeves like Boy Scout merit badges, was initiated shortly after the Nazis opened Dachau in 1933. We'll move on to the cult of souvenirs. Producing ephemera as badges of allegiance were common among all regimes and democracies too. Mao pins and badges, which appeared in China before the Cultural Revolution and were produced sporadically until the Revolution, were among the most coveted pieces of cultural revolutionary jewelry. They were fairly cheap to produce on thin metals, and the government made large quantities in hundreds of iterations. Oh, here's the chocolate Mao again. Of all the propagandistic memorabilia for exclusive use inside China, the most curious were the thousands of different colorful porcelain figurines and dimensional friezes, the equivalent of three-dimensional posters, what I call revolutionary Hummelware. They canonized real and symbolic heroes and events of the Chinese Communist Party. This is Madame Mao and the characters she would use in her films and plays. This represents the peasant, the worker, and the militia. This represents different aspects of the militia and the People's Revolutionary Army. And this is the model soldier. The Red Book was used because that was the Bible of the regime. This was a militia peasant. And this was a militia political soldier. And this one showing male and female workers astride a silver missile with a Mao quotation, "Exceed US and UK," symbolized Mao's anti-capitalist economic plans and marked the end of the Cultural Revolution when propaganda turned inward. It also offers other suggestions. Yet among the most prized, if eerie, of all the porcelains were variety featuring smiling red guards, men and women, proud factory workers, and patriotic peasants perpetrating cruel, though officially sanctioned, acts of humiliation on petty bourgeoisie, landowners, and other social criminals. Kneeling doggy style, since they were considered criminal dogs, they were wearing dunce caps, the favored symbol of punishment, and signs hanging from their necks scrawled with derogatory slogans. And then we come to today, what I call the cult of stupidity. This is a department store or a boutique store in Korea that uses Hitler imagery, Nazi imagery, as fashion. And then, of course, here's the brand conflated into the worst possible neo-Nazi icon. What this also shows is not just a historical view of what was done in the 20th century, but how designers were marshaled to create images that would manipulate the public. The point of this book, the point of this show, is to urge designers to take the responsibility that they must have, that their design can have power in the contexts that I showed you, in context yet to be determined. So that's what Iron Fists is all about. It's kind of a cautionary tale. And what you see in this last picture is the result of how imagery can be manipulated and used to spread a heinous idea and ideology.